The envelope sat unopened on the kitchen counter for 3 days. Rain hammered against the windows of a small apartment in Portland as Marcus Reyes stared at the return address, Hartwell Biotech, Legal Department. His 6-year-old son Theo was asleep down the hall, clutching a toy dinosaur missing half its tail. Marcus had a feeling, the kind that settles in your chest like a stone, that whatever was inside that envelope was about to detonate the careful, quiet life he'd built from nothing. He'd picked it up a dozen times. Turned it over in his hands. Smelled, almost absurdly, like it might tell him something through the paper itself. Each time, he set it back down exactly where it had been, as if leaving it untouched might also leave his life untouched. He didn't know yet that in exactly 9 days, a woman worth $400 million would be standing in his doorway, asking him to give up his son. But what happened next, nobody expected. 6 months earlier, none of this existed. There was no envelope, no looming threat, no billionaire. There was only Marcus, a high school chemistry teacher, and Theo, and the quiet rhythm of bedtime stories and burnt pancakes. There was the small, sacred chaos of packing lunches at 7 a.m., of scrubbing crayon off the wall, of falling asleep on the couch halfway through a cartoon neither of them finished. Can you imagine spending years believing your family is unshakable, only to learn the ground beneath you was never really yours? That's exactly where this story begins. Marcus Reyes was 34, broad-shouldered from years of weekend construction work he picked up to cover the bills teaching never quite did. He had kind, tired eyes and a laugh that came easy, even when life didn't give him much reason to use it. His students liked him because he never pretended to have all the answers, in chemistry or in life. His neighbors liked him because he was the kind of man who shoveled the whole sidewalk, not just his stretch of it. 5 years ago, his sister Elena had died in a car accident, leaving behind a newborn son, Theo, and no father listed on the birth certificate. Marcus, only 29 at the time, hadn't hesitated. He'd quit his second job, sold his car, moved into a smaller apartment, and adopted Theo within the year, becoming not an uncle but a father, in every way that mattered. He remembered the exact weight of Theo in his arms the first night, impossibly small, impossibly loud, impossibly his. There were nights, early on, when Marcus sat on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m., a screaming infant in his arms, wondering if he was doing any of it right. There was no manual for grief and fatherhood arriving at once. But somewhere between the sleepless nights and the first wobbling steps across the living room, Theo had stopped feeling like a responsibility and started feeling like the entire center of gravity in Marcus's life. What Marcus didn't know, what nobody had told him, was that Elena had used an anonymous donor through a fertility clinic 2 years before Theo was born. She'd never told a soul, not even Marcus, embarrassed perhaps, or simply private the way she'd always been about matters of the heart. And that donor was not anonymous at all, not really. He was Richard Callaway, the now-deceased founder of Hartwell Biotech, a man who had fathered 3 biological children through donations he made in his 20s, long before later marrying into staggering wealth and building an empire that bore his name on glass towers across the country. Richard Callaway had died 8 months ago, quietly, of heart failure, in a mansion far too large for the silence that had filled it in his final years. His will contained a clause his lawyers were only now untangling, a clause requiring all biological children, donor-conceived or otherwise, to be located and offered a stake in the family trust. It had taken his legal team months of confidential DNA registry searches, court orders, and careful cross-referencing before one name surfaced, Theo Reyes. That was how Vivian Callaway, Richard's only legitimate daughter and the new CEO of Hartwell Biotech, ended up standing outside a modest 2-bedroom apartment on a rain-soaked Tuesday, holding a folder that could unravel a stranger's entire life. Dramatic pause. She had imagined this conversation 100 times on the flight from New York, rehearsed the language, anticipated the questions, prepared for tears, even anger. She had not imagined the man who opened the door, and she certainly hadn't imagined how completely he would dismantle every assumption she carried with her. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked, one hand braced on the doorframe, Theo's cartoon blaring faintly behind him, the smell of mac and cheese still hanging in the air from dinner. Vivian Calloway, 31, sharp-eyed and dressed like she'd stepped out of a boardroom rather than off a red-eye flight, held up the folder like a shield. "I need to speak with you about Theo. It's a legal matter. May I come in?" Marcus's stomach dropped the way it does when you sense, before you understand, that something is wrong. He didn't move from the doorway. "Theo is my son," he said carefully, each word deliberate, as if saying it firmly enough might make this stranger disappear. "Whatever this is, you can say it right here." Vivian hesitated, a rare thing for her. In boardrooms, she dismantled hostile takeovers without blinking, negotiated with men twice her age who underestimated her at their own peril. But something about this man's protective stance, the way his whole body had angled itself between her and the apartment behind him, unsettled her composure in a way no shareholder ever had. "My father," she said finally, "was Theo's biological father. A sperm donation, before I was born. My father's will requires that any biological children be formally identified and included in the family trust. That includes a $42 million inheritance share, held for Theo until he turns 18, under a guardian approved by the estate." Marcus felt the floor tilt. "Approved guardian," he repeated slowly, his voice low and dangerous in a way Vivian hadn't expected from a man in a faded t-shirt with flowers still dusted on his sleeve. "Meaning what? Meaning you think you get to decide if I'm fit to raise my own son?" "That's not what Vivian started, but Marcus had already shut the conversation down with the kind of quiet fury that scared people more than shouting ever could. "Get off my porch," he said. "I don't want your money, and I don't want lawyers showing up at my door while my kid is watching cartoons 15 feet away. You don't know anything about us. You don't know what it took to get here." He closed the door, not slammed, just closed, firm and final, which somehow felt worse. Vivian stood in the rain for a long moment, the folder growing damp in her hands, something unfamiliar twisting in her chest. She had expected gratitude, maybe negotiation, maybe even hostility born of greed. She had not expected to be looked at like a threat to a child's safety, and she had certainly not expected how much that look would stay with her on the long drive back to her hotel. What she didn't know was that this would not be the last time she stood on that porch, and it would not be the last time Marcus Reyes upended everything she thought she understood about her own family. That night, in her hotel room overlooking the wet, glittering city, Vivian sat at the desk with the folder open in front of her, untouched. She found herself thinking not about the $42 million, not about the legal clause, but about the cartoon noise drifting from behind that apartment door, and the particular ferocity in a stranger's eyes when he thought his son was being threatened. She had never seen anyone fight for her like that. Not once. And the thought arrived uninvited, sharp and unwelcome. Maybe the money wasn't the most valuable thing in that apartment. 3 days later, the envelope arrived, formal notice that Hartwell Biotech's legal team intended to file for a guardianship review, in the best interest of the beneficiary. Marcus read it twice, hands shaking, then drove 40 minutes to Hartwell's downtown office with Theo strapped into the back seat because he had no one to watch him on short notice, and because some stubborn part of him refused to leave his son anywhere out of his sight while strangers debated his fitness as a father. He didn't make it past the lobby before security stopped him, two broad men in suits eyeing his work jacket and his son's untied shoelaces with thinly veiled suspicion. But Vivian, crossing through on her way to a board meeting, saw the boy peeking around his father's leg, clutching the same battered dinosaur toy, and something in her froze. "Let him through," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the lobby's polished hum. In her glass-walled office, Marcus didn't sit. Theo sat instead, perched carefully on the edge of a leather chair, swinging his feet, eyes wide at the size of the room. "You want to take my son and hand him to strangers because some lawyer thinks money makes a better parent than love," Marcus said, his voice low and shaking with restrained fury. "I buried my sister. I have raised this boy since he was 8 weeks old. I have never missed a single school play, a single fever in the night, nothing." His voice cracked, just slightly, betraying the exhaustion underneath the anger. "And you want a judge to decide if I'm good enough?" Vivian looked at the folder on her desk, then at the boy now quietly examining a glass paperweight on her shelf, careful not to touch it, asking permission with his eyes first, a small, almost reflexive gesture of consideration that no 6-year-old should have to think about, but clearly had been taught, gently and consistently, by someone who cared. Something about that small, careful gesture undid her more than anything Marcus had said. "I don't actually want to take him from you," Vivian said slowly, almost surprised by her own words, the practiced corporate language falling away. "The estate's lawyers built this clause to prevent fraud, people claiming false paternity for inheritance money. I have to verify the family is stable. That's all this was ever supposed to be. I think my legal team turned a formality into a war." Marcus stared at her, disbelief and exhaustion warring on his face. "Then call them off." "It's not that simple," Vivian admitted, glancing toward Theo, who had now moved on to studying a framed photograph on her bookshelf, a photograph of a stern, gray-haired man Marcus didn't recognize. "But I can change how this happens. Give me 2 weeks. Let me actually understand who you and Theo are, before any review goes to a judge. No lawyers in the room. Just us." Marcus hesitated, every protective instinct screaming at him to walk away, to take Theo home, to bury this entire chapter and never speak of it again. But there was something in Vivian's face, a crack in the polish, a flicker of something almost like loneliness, that made him pause. 2 weeks, he said finally. "And if I feel like this is hurting him, even a little, it's over. No more visits, no more lawyers, nothing." "Agreed," Vivian said. Pause, callback hook number 2, that envelope on the kitchen counter, the one Marcus had stared at for 3 days, was no longer just paperwork. It had become the opening chapter of a story he never asked to be part of, and somehow, impossibly, he was about to agree to write more of it. What followed were 2 strange, careful weeks. Vivian visited on weekends, awkward at first in her tailored clothes among crayon drawings and dinosaur figurines, perched stiffly on the edge of the couch like she was afraid of leaving a mark. She brought no toys, no extravagant gestures. She'd learned, watching Marcus, that Theo cared more about someone sitting on the floor with him than anything wrapped in a bow. By the second weekend, she was sitting cross-legged on the carpet, sleeves rolled up, helping Theo sort plastic dinosaurs by species with the same focused intensity she usually reserved for quarterly earnings reports. Marcus watched this transformation with a wary kind of fascination. The woman who had shown up at his door with a folder and a threat seemed, slowly, to be peeling away layers of armor she hadn't known she was wearing. She asked questions about Theo's favorite foods, his fear of thunderstorms, the way he insisted on sleeping with his closet door cracked exactly 4 inches. She wrote nothing down. She simply listened, in a way that struck Marcus as oddly unfamiliar for someone who ran a multi-billion-dollar company. But the mystery deepened in a direction no one anticipated. Digging through her father's private files to prepare the guardianship report, Vivian found something that stopped her cold late one night, alone in her father's old study, surrounded by boxes of documents she hadn't had the heart to sort through since his funeral, a sealed letter, dated the year before Richard Calloway's death, addressed simply to Elena's son. Her hands trembled as she turned the envelope over. Her father had known about Theo. Not through some clinical DNA match conducted by lawyers after his death. He had tracked Elena down years earlier, learned of her pregnancy, and quietly funded prenatal care under a shell account, all without ever making contact, terrified of disrupting a life he had no right to claim. There were bank statements, small and unremarkable transfers spanning years, each one a silent, anonymous gesture from a man too afraid to reach out directly. The letter explained everything. Richard's guilt over donating anonymously in his 20s without understanding the lives he might touch, his fear of being a stranger who showed up only when money was involved, and his final wish, not control over Theo's upbringing, but simply the hope that someday his son would know he'd been thought of, even from a distance, even by a man who never found the courage to say so while he was alive. Vivian read it 3 times before showing it to Marcus, sitting at his kitchen table on a quiet Thursday evening, Theo already asleep down the hall. "He didn't want to take Theo from you," she said quietly, her composure finally breaking. Tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally slipping free. "He spent his whole life building walls so high nobody could reach him, and the one time he tried to reach out to someone, he was too scared to actually do it. I think I've been doing the same thing. Hiding behind lawyers and folders because actually showing up terrified me more than any boardroom ever has. Can you imagine carrying a secret like that for years, only to have it surface in a stranger's living room, read aloud to a man who has every reason to hate the person reading it?" Marcus didn't say anything for a long moment. He reached over and took the letter gently from her hands, reading it himself, his jaw tightening with every line. He just looked at Theo's empty doorway, then at Vivian, utterly unaware that his entire history had just shifted beneath him. "He watched from a distance for years," Marcus said finally, voice rough. "And never once asked for anything." He set the letter down carefully, like it was something fragile. "That's more than most people manage." But that's when the real crisis hit. Hartwell's board, learning that Vivian had personally intervened and delayed the guardianship filing, accused her of jeopardizing the trust's legal standing, and worse, leaked a distorted version of the story to the press. Callaway heiress battles teacher over secret love child's inheritance. The headline detonated across every feed within hours, accompanied by a grainy paparazzi photo of Vivian standing on Marcus's porch in the rain, looking, out of context, exactly like a predator circling a vulnerable family. Reporters camped outside Marcus's apartment building by sunrise, vans with satellite dishes lining the narrow street, microphones thrust toward anyone who came within 10 feet of the front door. A school administrator called him into an emergency meeting over concerns about appropriateness, her tone careful and clinical in a way that made Marcus's blood boil. Theo, confused and frightened by the cameras outside his window, asked his father in a small, trembling voice if they were going to be taken away from each other. Whisper, that question broke something in Marcus that no lawsuit ever could. He spent that night pacing the apartment long after Theo finally fell asleep, phone buzzing relentlessly with unknown numbers, the blinds drawn tight against flashing camera lenses. By morning, exhausted and raw, he made a decision. He showed up at Hartwell's headquarters one final time, fury and heartbreak colliding in his chest, ignoring the cluster of reporters who recognized him instantly and surged forward with questions he refused to answer. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he told Vivian, standing in her office, voice raw and trembling with exhaustion. "The second your world touched mine, it crushed everything I built to protect him. He's 6 years old, and there are strangers outside our home shouting questions about money. Maybe the lawyers were right. Maybe people like you and people like me were never supposed to mix." He thought of the envelope on the kitchen counter again, how he'd known, the moment he saw it, that his quiet, ordinary life was about to be destroyed. He had been right. Every fear from that rainy Tuesday 3 weeks ago had come true, multiplied 100 times over by cameras and headlines he never asked for. Vivian, for the first time, had no folder, no legal language, no composure left to hide behind. She stood up from her desk, hands trembling, the woman who'd once dismantled hostile takeovers without blinking now utterly undone by the sight of a man ready to walk away forever. "Then let me fix it," she said, voice breaking completely. "Publicly. Completely. I'll walk away from the board if that's what it takes to make this stop. I'll tell them everything, my father's letter, all of it. I am not going to let my family's mess be the reason your son grows up afraid of cameras." Nobody in that room could have predicted what came next. Vivian called an emergency press conference the following morning, against the explicit advice of every lawyer and board member who tried to stop her. Standing alone at the podium, no lawyers, no PR team, no prepared statement vetted by committee, she told the truth in full, her father's letter, his quiet decades of guilt, his hope rather than his claim, the years of anonymous support sent without ever once asking for acknowledgement. She announced she was withdrawing the guardianship review entirely and establishing an irrevocable trust in Theo's name, with Marcus as sole permanent guardian, no conditions attached, no oversight, no strings. My father spent his life too afraid to show up, she said, her voice steady despite the cameras flashing relentlessly around her, despite the dozens of reporters scribbling furiously. He left a letter instead of a relationship, because reaching out terrified him more than staying silent. I'm done being afraid. Marcus Reyes has raised his son with more love and integrity than this company has shown in its entire history, and I will not let anyone, including myself, turn that into a headline. The board, stunned by the public outpouring of support for her honesty, didn't fire her. If anything, the company's reputation softened overnight. People didn't see a heartless heiress anymore. They saw someone who'd chosen a child's well-being over a corporate narrative, and somehow that vulnerability did more for Hartwell's image than any carefully managed press release ever could have. Marcus watched the press conference from his living room, Theo curled beside him, the same dinosaur toy in his lap, both of them still slightly rattled from the chaos of the past week. When Vivian showed up at his door that evening, for the first time without a folder, without an agenda, just a small wrapped gift she'd nearly talked herself out of bringing 3 separate times on the drive over, Theo answered before his father could even reach the door. Is that for me? Theo asked, eyeing the box with undisguised curiosity. It's a model dinosaur kit, Vivian said, crouching to his eye level, oddly nervous for a woman who negotiated billion-dollar mergers without breaking a sweat. Your dad said your old one was getting pretty beat up. This one even roars, if you put the batteries in. Theo grinned and ran off to find his father's toolbox, already planning to build it that night, his fear from the past week momentarily forgotten in the simple joy of a new toy. Marcus stood in the doorway, watching his son's joy, then looked at Vivian, really looked at her, the way you look at someone once the armor finally comes off on both sides. Thank you, he said quietly, for choosing the truth instead of the easy version. That took more courage than most people have. I almost didn't, Vivian admitted, wrapping her arms around herself against the evening chill. I spent my whole life thinking strength meant never needing anyone, never showing a crack. Your son taught me that's not strength. That's just loneliness with better furniture and a corner office. They didn't rush anything after that. There was no grand romance montage, no overnight transformation. Just Sunday dinners that slowly became a habit, a woman who learned to sit on hardwood floors building dinosaur models with sticky fingers and crooked instructions, and a little boy who, 6 months later, asked Vivian if she wanted to come to his school's father-daughter, and then, catching himself, just family day. The reporters eventually moved on to the next scandal, the next headline, as reporters always do. The trust fund sat quietly untouched, growing in the background of a life that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with 2 people who'd nearly let fear keep them apart. The envelope that once sat unopened on that kitchen counter is framed now, tucked in a drawer Marcus rarely opens. Not as a reminder of the threat it once carried, but of how something that nearly tore his family apart became the very thing that built it back, stronger, into something neither of them ever expected. Sometimes the people we're most afraid to let in are the ones who finally teach us what home is supposed to feel like. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't holding on tighter, it's finally, terrifyingly, letting someone in. If this story moved you, let us know what part stayed with you the most. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.